Hello everybody, I'm Dan. Welcome to my Java tutorial series. Throughout my tutorials I will teach you Java using just Notepad and the command prompt. The order in which my tutorials are organized on both my website at javacjava.com and my YouTube playlist is designed to maximize learning by building on concepts from prior tutorials. This tutorial is about the throws keyword. I'm going to open up my web browser to my website, javacjava.com, select menu, and Java OOP tutorials. I'll scroll all the way down here to the throws keyword, exceptions throws keyword tutorial. So the throws keyword is used to create a list of checked exceptions that are not handled in the code block of either a method or a constructor. A method or constructor does not need to specify any unhandled, unchecked exceptions in the throws list. Now the throws list must be after the method or constructor signature and before the opening curly brace of the code block. So it looks like this, right? You got your return type, method name, along with the parameter list. This is known as the method signature right here. And then you'll have the throws keyword and then the exception class. And if you have multiple exception classes that it's inside of your method body, multiple checked exception classes, you'll want to separate them by commas. So, and then you'll have your opening curly brace, closing curly brace indicating the method body. Right? So inside of the method body area here, any unchecked exceptions that occur in there that aren't handled or whatnot there, you'll have to put them throws and then the name of the exception class there. Now Java exception handling has a principle called catch or specify, called the catch or specify requirement that applies to checked exceptions. Now a method or constructor body that invokes a method or constructor that throws a checked exception must either handle that exception with a try-catch statement or specify that the checked exception or specify that checked exception in the throws list. All right, let's go ahead and come down here and highlight all this source code. Control C to copy or right click and select copy. Now I'm going to move my browser off screen here. I've got a shortcut to the command prompt on my desktop, but if you don't, you can create one really quick by right-clicking, selecting New Shortcut, type in CMD, Next, and Finish. Okay, it's just that easy. I'm going to go ahead and open up the command prompt, type in javac, which is the Java compiler command. You should see all this stuff scroll by. Now, however, if you get an error message, watch my tutorial on installing the Java development kit. You want to make sure you get that installed and configured properly before continuing. CLS to clear the screen, CD space backslash. CD is short for change directory, and backslash tells it to go to the root. I'm going to make a directory using the MD command called Java. And I already have that folder, but if you don't, it'll create it for you. I'm going to change directories to the Java folder now. And I'm going to make another directory here, and I'm just going to call this exception throws. Change directory to that, notepad, exception throws.java. All right, exception throws.java is going to be the name of my source code file, also known as a compilation unit. Go ahead and paste my source code in there. Let's go ahead and save this here. I've got several classes in here. Exception throws has my main method entry point and my main method code block here, and I have this other class here called throw some stuff, right? And it has two methods in it, throw and IOE, which is just IO exception short for that, right? And it is going to call throw new IO exception. Okay. Now because we don't do anything with this, we throw this up, we have to declare in the throws list up here that it throws an IO exception. Because IO exception is actually a checked exception here. So here's the documentation for IO exception. You can see IO exception is a subclass of exception, which means this is a checked exception there, right? And so it has a whole bunch of stuff underneath it there too as well, right? So we're throwing a new IO exception and we're not handling it in any particular way, so we have to come up here and do throws IO exception. Now what that does is that basically says, okay, anything that's going to be invoking throw and IOE has to handle the exception. So we come back up here to the main method. The first thing I'm going to do is create a a throw some stuff, which is this class here, reference variable type throw some stuff, and set that equal to a new throw some stuff object there. Now, because I'm enclosing the TSS and invoking the throw and IOE method here, I'm going to go ahead and catch the IO exception E and then display it, just this string literal of the console plus the value of the E object, which will basically, behind the scenes, implicitly invoke the toString method, but neither here nor there. All right, so this is an example of throwing just a standard IO exception that's underneath the exception class. Now, what I thought I'd do is I'd go ahead and kind of reiterate how to make your own custom exceptions too in this one here as well. So I have this class invalid measurement exception, right? And this is how you make your own custom exception. And I have a whole tutorial on making your own custom exceptions, but I'll just reiterate this here. So you want to name it whatever. I just picked invalid measurement here because that's going to tie in to the box class up here. Invalid measurement, you always want to like put exception on the end of that. It's just kind of a standard, lets people know that this class is actually an exception class. And then extends exception. All right, so for the constructor here, the only thing it does in the constructor block is it calls the super constructor and it passes the this string literal here, measurement. Measurement argument can not be 0 or negative, right? And that's just invokes a constructor in the exception class here that loads that in. Okay, so let's talk about the box class here. So the box class has the int length, height, width all set to 0, private, so nicely encapsulated there. And one of the things that we want to ensure is that getVolume doesn't return back any sort of 0 value or negative value here. So in this particular class, and I've simplified it from some of my previous tutorials here, I just have a single constructor, right? Length, height, and width for that there. And I've got the throws keyword here, and then invalid measurement exception. All right, so if length is less than or equal to 0, height is less than or equal to 0, width is less than or equal to 0, then it's going to throw new and then invalid measurement exception, right? And if it does throw those, then these lines aren't even executed at all down here. So, but basically, if we're good to go on that, making that box there, then it'll go ahead and set the instance variables length, height, and width up here equal to the parameter variables coming in here. So, all right, fairly simple on that. So, inside of throw some stuff here, right? I've got this other method here called make box error. Okay, and what it does in here is it sets this reference variable b of box type equal to a new box object and invokes the box constructor with the arguments of 9, -5, and 4. Now, of course, when height comes in as -5, it's going to be less than or equal to 0. That's going to cause this to throw a new invalid measurement exception. All right, so that basically, by specifying this throws up here, says we have to, anything that invokes this constructor or method for that matter, but we'll just, since this is a constructor, so it's the same rules apply to methods as constructors, but basically this is saying this, since this is a checked type exception, we have to have this in here, otherwise we're going to get a compiler error there. Then inside of the make box error there, you'll notice I don't enclose this in a try and catch, and I did that on purpose because what this is going to do by including this throws up here, that allows this particular method here inside of the throw some stuff class to duck the exception and pass the exception up the call stack here to the original TSS invocation of make box error right here. So this one ultimately has to actually do something with it there, right? Let's go ahead and save this and give it a go here, and I'll go over just a few more things on this here. So let's clear our screen. Compile it, run it. Okay, so you can see caught the IO exception, java.io exception. All right, excellent. So that's what happens when we call the throw new exception, pass the exception on up the call stack to this method where it was called there, and then we caught the IO exception, and that was good, right? And then on the next one here, so caught the box exception, measurement argument cannot be 0 or negative, right? And I'm displaying the get message right here on that. So when we invoke the make box error, that called this particular method, which then basically in the process of creating this box object invoked the box constructor, right? And it had an invalid measurement, so we threw a new invalid measurement exception, right? And since we called throws invalid measurement exception, it passed it back to here, right? Up the call stack on that, right? And since we didn't handle this in any way with a try catch, we had to put in this throws here, or else we'll get an error on that, right? So let's start messing around with some of this stuff here. Let's just go ahead and, for example, take this out right here, right? Actually, I want to just copy that before I take that out. And we're just going to comment this line out here. And let's say, for example, tss.throw and IOE, right? Okay. So when we go to compile this, we're going to get a nice little error here. Okay, so unreported exception, IO exception, must be caught or declared to be thrown, right? And so basically that's telling us since we don't have, now watch this, if I put this back in here, right? Now our error, which is on line 23, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I save this here. We're just going to recompile that. Okay, now we get the same error, right? But now it is up here on tss.throw and IOE. So you can see it passed the error all the way up here, and now on line 6 we have to do something with that, right? And the proper thing to do in the main method of that, of course, is just go ahead and handle the try catch. But we do have one other option. We could come up here to the main method and say, for example, throws IO exception, right? Now we're passing the buck to basically nothing, right? And that's going to cause some interesting results, right? So you ready to see what that does? What that does is our program now compiles, of course, but what's going to happen when we run this? Okay, so now, since we propagated the exception clear even outside of main, right, it basically causes it to, you know, crash like a normal exception would do there, right? So that's what's going on there. So if we don't, we either have to catch, right, which is this try catch right here, right, or specify. And so when you hear this wording in here in Java, you know, catch or specify requirement that applies to checked exceptions, that's exactly what that is. You either have to try catch it, right, or you have to specify that you're going to throw it up to the next thing on the call stack, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and take this out, and let's go ahead and save this. Actually, let's just put it all back to the way it was, where it was working there. I'm going to show you some interesting stuff here. All right, let's go ahead and compile this, run it again just to get it all working again. Okay, so there, we caught the IO exception, we caught the box exception, so everything's back to working there. All right, so that's good. So here is our specify, right? We're specifying that this throws the IO exception, and then we're catching it further up in the next method up the call stack, which is the main method here. So what do you think would happen here? Because any subclasses of the exception class are checked exceptions. So what would happen, for example, if we made this a runtime exception? Let's just screw around with this, because runtime exceptions are unchecked exceptions. Let's just go ahead and see what happens here. Let's clear our screen. Let's compile this. All right, it compiles great. And look at that, it runs great too as well. That's interesting, right? Okay, now, what if we, for example, remove this right here, right? And comment this up here. Let's recompile. And there we go, right? So we didn't get any compile errors there by changing this to a runtime exception. Runtime exceptions are, of course, like given like the green light to go. It doesn't make sure that anything has to be ever implemented or anything like that. And since we aren't implementing any sort of try or catch or anything like that, it goes ahead and goes ahead and runs and everything like that. So that's basically the difference between a checked exception and unchecked exception is the class that it's derived from there. So let's put this back to extends exception. Let's go ahead and save this here. Now we're going to start getting some compiler errors right off the bat rather than, oops. Okay, so unreported exception, invalid measurement exception must be caught or declared to be thrown, right? And that's saying it's on the tss.makeBox error. All right, so as we go ahead and put all this stuff back in here, right? Call this throws invalid measurement exception. Which we'll pass that up there, and then we'll actually catch it up here, okay? And everything will be back to being happy. Then there's one last thing I want to go over here with you for this error. So we catch in both the exceptions. All right. Now, if you've had a sharp eagle eye, you may have noticed something here, right? My invalid measurement exception class, right, is a subclass of exception. Now, when I throw new invalid measurement class, you can see I'm throwing invalid measurement exception. All right, so up here, right, I'm doing make box error, and in this particular method here, when I invoke this, and I'm doing throws invalid measurement exception. And then in my try catch here on the make box error, I'm catching exception. You might be going, okay, well that's not the same thing, invalid measurement exception. And I'm just going to show you this here. So invalid measurement exception is a direct subclass of exception, right? And that's because I said it extends exception. So watch this, right? So let's go ahead and save this. And we still get the exception caught. Now, what's happened is that it's checking for it, and it's saying, okay, when we do the try catch here, right? Because, let's change this back to exception here, save this. Okay, back to that. Let's clear our screen actually and run this again there. So exception is the superclass of throws invalid measurement exception. So you can catch any sort of exception that is in the hierarchy from any of them that are being thrown under here, right? And of course, exception is a subclass of throwable, right? Which is all the way up at the top. So this is even valid right here. See? So that's something to consider there. Now let's say, for example, I did something like this. And then instead of right here, I said throws exception, right? So we're basically turning invalid measurement exception, throwing that, and then we come down here, we're throwing exception, and this is valid because this is the superclass. Now, however, because we've turned this particular throws exception up, it's basically one up the, it's a superclass, right? We can no longer catch the subclass of that without receiving having some problems there, right? So now we get unreported exception must be caught or thrown, right? So that's basically what you can do. You can never, if you decide to throw a superclass there, you can never further up down the call stack, I should say, is catch a subclass exception there. All right, so hopefully that's not too confusing on that, but that's just kind of an interesting thing that I wanted to go over and seemed like a good idea to do that at the time. You can now change this, for example, to exception because that looks good right there. and then we're all good. Let's clear our screen. And one of the things you'll notice, it doesn't actually change the message there. So even though we're catching an exception, when we display e.getMessage, you notice it still has our measurement argument cannot be 0 or negative. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that, and just leave you guys with a quick final thought there. So a method or constructor body that invokes a method or constructor that throws a checked exception must either handle that exception with a try-catch statement or specify that checked exception in the throws list. That concludes this tutorial. Thanks for watching.